Good evening. Whew. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and especially when it's so beautiful outside, smoke-free skies. My name is Megan Stark. I'm the chair of the First Year Reading Experience Committee. And before we begin tonight's event, I would like to extend my thanks to some people who make this program happen. The excellent members of the First Year Reading Committee who work so hard throughout the course of the year, reading, in order to bring you amazing writers to our campus. President Engstrom and his wife Mary, the Office of the Provost for their ongoing support, and then so many members of the campus and Missoula community who collaborated with us, in particular this year, the Missoula Public Library, the Montana Book Festival, the Trail Book Club, and the University Bookstore. So I'd like to welcome, before we get started, I'd like to welcome our own professor, Dan Spencer, who's here in Environmental Studies, and he will be giving an introduction to our evening speaker.
And one housekeeping detail before I introduce our speaker, I would invite all of you with electronic devices to turn them off or turn them to silent so that we can be uninterrupted in our talk tonight. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to introduce John Vaillant, who's the author of this year's First Year Reading book called The Tiger, A True Story of Vengeance and Survival. I just had the pleasure of having dinner with John, among other folks here, and part of what I think we're going to hear tonight is part of the story behind the story. The story itself is so fascinating. Those of you who have read it already know this, but the story behind the story is equally fascinating. When I was reading this book, I couldn't help but think of a class that I teach each year called Nature and Society, where we look at how human societies and the natural world in all its different manifestations have influenced each other since the rise of the human species. John Vaillant's book, The Tiger, is really a case study in that relationship. It's a fascinating and penetrating look at how the tiger has influenced human cultures and societies across Asia since time immemorial, and how the shape of evolving human societies and cultures now shape the fate and survival of the tiger itself. Vaillant shows particularly how in Russia, with the collapse of communism in the early 1990s and the rise of perestroika, changed society and the economy in fundamental ways and very dramatically throughout Russia, but particularly in the far east of Russia, and in turn ended up driving many of its inhabitants to turn to poaching the Amur tiger in order to meet their own survival needs. As those of you who have read the book know, The Tiger is a book that operates on many different levels. Parts of it read like a thriller, as circumstances build toward fateful encounters between a tiger and the humans who have moved into the tiger's territory. Other parts open up the historical and socioeconomic context of post-perestroika Russia in the late 20th century that altered fundamentally human livelihoods in the remote Primoria region of Russia's far eastern border that ended up making collisions between the humans and tigers almost inevitable. And still other parts take us into the intimacy of Russian family and village life, showing us what the human drama of small Russian villages, families, and workers trying to find a way to survive in a wild part of Russia undergoing dramatic social and economic disintegration. Together, John Vaillant then weaves a compelling tale of evolving nature and society with the fate of the Amur tiger hanging in the balance. So just who is this speaker we're going to have here tonight? I had a chance to have supper with him. Among other things, John Vaillant is a freelance writer whose work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, National Geographic, and Outside Magazine, among many others. In fact, it was an article in The New Yorker that led to one of his first book called The Golden Spruce, published about 10 years ago. It was a bestseller and won several different awards, including the Governor General's Award for Nonfiction in Canada. The Tiger is his second book, and it's also received numerous awards, including the British Columbia National Book Award for Nonfiction, the CBC Award for Best Overall Book, the Hubert Evans Nonfiction Award, the Banff Mountain Festival Special Jury Prize, the CBA Libris Award for Nonfiction, the Sigurd Olson Nature Writing Award, and the Prix Nicolas Bouvier. And then in 2014, John Vaillant received a Donald Wyndham Sandy Campbell Literature Prize in Nonfiction. And then, as he mentioned tonight, most recently he's moved to the darker side, and actually his most recent book is a novel. He's moved into the realm of fiction with a fascinating book looking at the journey of an immigrant from Mexico into the United States called The Jaguar's Children. So we're in for a treat tonight, and I just want to have you join me in welcoming John Vaillant here to the University of Montana.
Good evening. The way being described like that makes me want to hear me too. That was really nice. Thank you. We're going to start the timer. And really thrilled to be here. I would especially like to thank the First Year Reads Committee. It's, believe me, it's a gauntlet to make it this far. And there are bloody carcasses lying on the side of the road on the way to this podium, and I'm glad I'm not one of them. So I'm really, really flattered to be here, and also thrilled to be dovetailing with the Montana Book Festival. That's a lucky synchronicity. So I should confess, though, that the last time I was in Montana, I was sent to Clinton by a now defunct magazine called Sports Afield, and what they sent me to do was to write about prairie oysters at the Testicle Festival. And so you're all regulars, I guess. It might have changed since then, but I recall a great many drunken people in various stages of undress, and who really took the act of partying to morbid extremes. And there was one guy I remember describing to me, and with a smile on his face, how he'd spent the previous night with his ankles and wrists duct taped together. And another fellow was very eager to show me the footage that he had captured of various pornographic scenes shot from some bush near the campsite that he had been hiding in. It was, really raw and rude. What I finally concluded after 2 days in that godforsaken place was that to make prairie oysters edible, you have to bathe them in hot sauce and then bathe yourself in bourbon to the point that the words testicle and festival rhyme. And I don't recommend that, especially to the first years, but really not to anybody. It's not a healthy or wholesome way to spend time. And I really took a long shower after that, and in all honesty, that article was published, and a number of people canceled their subscriptions to Sports Afield after reading it. So anyway, I take actually being invited back to this state and being allowed to stand before you in this beautiful theater as a true measure of personal and professional progress. And that I haven't squandered the last 15 years. So really, really proud to be here. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the genesis of the Tiger and about the writing life in general. And honestly, I don't think any of you would be at this university or even in this room if you couldn't write. But if you choose to take it to a morbid extreme and make a career out of it, like almost anything, it really takes a certain amount of natural talent, but mostly a kind of obsessive dedication and devotion and a really high tolerance for solitude. So, if you stick with it long enough, you'll find that writing can be a transformative process. And to give you an idea how transformative, this is a photograph of me during my first interview for the Tiger. And you can see the changes. I had no hair and an addiction to milk, and I'm really a completely different person now. So you know, this book has altered me in ways you'll never know. Anyway, so proud to be to have the book resonate, you know, with this community in the way that it has. And one thing I, you know, realized just in the few conversations I've had thus far, there are so many points of entry to the book that seem to have connected with people in all different disciplines, and that's, you know, really, really gratifying to me as a writer. Because there's an element to writing that is very much like pretty much sticking a message in a bottle and heaving it over the side. And the silence after that initial splash can be deafening and last for a really long time. So, you know, you scribble away in your eccentric solitude, and you really never know where it's going to end up or what's going to happen. And so I've been very fortunate that the Tiger has had a wonderful journey. It's been published around the world in English. It's gone into 15 different languages. Film rights were optioned by Brad Pitt's film company, where it's in development right now. But what I think makes this Tiger story different, and why it got me to Montana, back to Montana, is because it isn't, as one prospective film producer said, Jaws with fur. And you know, we didn't go with that guy for some reason. But you know, that story's been told, and I read it. When I was 14 or so, I read with morbid fascination Jim Corbett's Man-Eaters of Kumeyain, and he was you know, a great white hunter working in India in the 1930s, and it's this book is a classic collection of true stories about Jim Corbett saving various nameless, barefoot natives from the scourge of these wild tigers. And, you know, these folks have no names, they really have no identity. The tigers always die in the end, and in many cases these were sick and extraordinarily dangerous animals that in some cases killed hundreds of people. So Corbett saved many lives, but I wanted to tell a different kind of tiger story. I started writing professionally back in 1997, and that's where the Testicle Festival came in, one of my very first assignments. And at the same time, though, I'd also started a file on Siberian tigers, and it's an animal I've always been fascinated by. You know, bears get to hibernate in the winter, but Siberian tigers don't. They're out there often alone in minus 40, minus 50, hunting day in and day out. And you know, these animals can weigh more than 500 pounds. They can jump across this stage in a single bound, and they will eat virtually anything with protein in it. But each article that I read and dutifully collected in the file really said more or less the same thing. Tigers are dangerous, they're beautiful, and they're endangered. And for years, I really had nothing to add until 2006 when I saw the film Conflict Tiger that I think is in the possession of this university. So some of you have seen it already. Anyway, it's a 1-hour British documentary about this, you know, exact case that I've been writing about. And you can also stream it on Vimeo if you swing that way. But I'd never heard of Conflict Tiger before. I sat down in a theater to watch it at a festival that I'd been invited to speak at. And within 15 minutes, I had this really startling sense of recognition. And the recognition, strangely enough, was of another story of collisions, which was my first book, The Golden Spruce. And both of them deal with a kind of interspecies murder with a quasi-mythical creature at the center. And the collisions in the Tiger are many, of course, human and animal, animist and Christian, communist and capitalist, Chinese and Russian, tradition and modernity, law and disorder. But at the hub, at the core, is the conflict that the Tiger had with this man, Vladimir Markov. And this is the only known photo of him, and it's on his grave. So I'm going to do a very quick reading and just the opening scene where Markov is having wounded this animal, is on his way back to his cabin, and he knows there's a wounded tiger out there. He's aware of what this tiger is capable of. Hanging in the trees as if caught there is a sickle of a moon. Its wan light scatters shadows on the snow below, only obscuring further the forest that this man negotiates now as much by feel as by sight. He's on foot and on his own, save for a single dog which runs ahead, eager to be heading home at last. All around, the black trunks of oak, pine, and poplar soar into the dark above the scrub and deadfall, and their branches form a tattered canopy overhead. Slender birches, whiter than the snow, seem to emit a light of their own, but it's like the coat of an animal in winter, cold to the touch and for itself alone. All is quiet in this dormant, frozen world. It's so cold that spit will freeze before it lands, so cold that a tree, brittle as straw and unable to contain its expanding sap, may spontaneously explode. As they progress, man and dog alike leave behind a wake of heat, and the contrails of their breath hang in pale clouds above their tracks. Their scent stays close in the windless dark, but their footfalls carry, and so, with every step, they announce themselves to the night. Despite the bitter cold, the man wears rubber boots better suited to the rain. His clothes, too, are surprisingly light, considering that he's been out all day searching. His gun has grown heavy on his shoulder, as have his rucksack and cartridge belt, but he knows this route like the back of his hand, and he's almost within sight of his cabin. Now, at last, he can allow himself the possibility of relief. Perhaps he imagines the lantern he will light and the fire he will build. Perhaps he imagines the burdens he will soon lay down. The water in the kettle is certainly frozen, but the stove is thinly walled, and soon it will glow fiercely against the cold and dark, just as his own body is doing now. And soon enough, there will be hot tea and a cigarette, followed by rice, meat, and more cigarettes, maybe a shot or two of vodka, if there's any left. He savors this ritual and knows it by rote. And then, as the familiar angles take shape across the clearing, the dog collides with a scent as with a wall and stops short, growling. They're hunting partners, and the man understands. Someone is there by the cabin. The hackles on the dog's back and on his own neck rise together, and together they hear a rumble in the dark that seems to come from everywhere at once. So, that picture always reminds me of Mike Tyson, but with an even thicker neck. It's a violent book because hunting is violent, and so is Russia. But I really see no value in describing that beyond mere titillation unless you put it into context. You could easily distill the tiger into a hair-raising hunting tale, but in my view, that misses the point. To write a story of this kind, I wanted to come out in a different place, with a new understanding of the world and how I fit into it. And I hope the same for my readers. Two nonfiction books that do this beautifully are David McCulloch's Johnstown Flood, which was really a seminal book for me, and Timothy Egan's The Worst Hard Time. These are stories of man-made catastrophes driven in part by greed and magical thinking that altered forever the lives and landscapes they touched. They're really modern American parables. Walter Lord's book, A Night to Remember, about the Titanic is another. If I was a prof, those books would be required reading. But I truly believe we live in a time where it's simply irresponsible to write a nonfiction book about jaws with fur. The state of tigers and of nature in general is simply too precarious now. I couldn't justify taking this story on without trying also to make sense of our historic and prehistoric relationship to tigers. How did we get to the point where there are barely 3,000 tigers left in the wild? down from an estimated 100,000 a century ago. And it's not just tigers. We're at a pivotal moment in our relationship to the natural world, and it's no time to fall back on cliches. Because of this, I suppose you could call the tiger a postmodern or pre-apocalyptic hunting story, in that everyone in it is endangered and hunting each other. And right now, the average life expectancy for a Russian man is 59. The Russian population is around 140 million and falling. The Russian Far East is actively depopulating, even as Chinese towns just across the border explode into cities. Things are not stable out there. There's that notion of the butterfly beating its wings here and influencing the hurricane over there. And as I looked at this story more closely, I realized that it was really a story of societal collapse. Many of you won't remember how thrilled we were when the Berlin Wall came down, but it was a huge deal. The collapse of communism was seen as an absolutely wonderful development, not just for us, but for the Russians. In fact, it was catastrophic, because as flawed as that system may have been, it was the only support network there was, and when it fell apart in 1991, it left a huge vacuum that allowed a small group of canny, well-connected Russians to perpetrate what has been called the greatest and most rapid theft of a nation's wealth in history. Russia, in the pillaged ruins of communism, became a feral and lawless state that created the conditions for the tiger to happen. This didn't happen under the Soviets. All those brown things in the foreground are the paws of bears, and they will be turned into soup, somewhere in South Asia. So it's not clear in Moscow, 7 time zones away from where the action in this story takes place, how the fate of humans and animals are intertwined, but in the Russian Far East, it is clear. And this, I think, is the reality of the world we live in. Whether we like it or not, whether we can see it or not, we are all intimately connected. And this is where scientists, writers, artists, students can play a powerful role. They can go out to remote frontiers or to their backyard, if you live in Missoula, and articulate the connections and show us what we're missing. So what I saw in this story was a parable for our times, and it had this extraordinarily charismatic animal at the center. Not just any animal, but an individual, a character with issues, with injuries, with enough data connected to it, thanks to the Russian wardens who studied it, that you could really bring him to life and to some extent get inside his head. You should probably know that Moby Dick and Beowulf are both totemic stories for me, these tales of tormented, vengeful beasts. Well, this story had elements of both. And not only was it true, it was happening right now in a place hardly anyone knew about. And one of the things that appealed to me most about this story was that it defied this notion of the helpless native that some white guy, with a big Henry rifle would come in and save. The natives being preyed upon were modern Russians with access to cars, phones, and weapons. Take off their winter hats and they would fit into this audience without a ripple. So different from the victims of lion and tiger attacks I read about when I was young. And at its core, this story was as much about a collision of cultures as it was about a hungry, wounded tiger. And of particular interest to me was the fact that each of the people who interacted with this particular tiger had his or her own story, a trajectory that brought them first to the Far East and then into this animal's terrible orbit. This tiger was personal for these people. And for some of the people were personal for the tiger. But how do you get this information and these details in Russia, especially if you don't speak Russian, as I do not? So, this is something that maybe is one reason I was the only person writing a book about this. When it was a film, it toured the globe. Thousands of people saw it, tens of thousands. And you would think some journalist among them would have thought, wow, that would make an amazing book. and nobody did. And I become very close to the director now, Sasha Snow, and he said I was the first person to approach him. And then when I started trying to get organized to go to the Russian Far East, I realized, what some of the obstacles were. Even after you get the visa, it's not a place that's really set up for tourists. Nobody speaks English there except a few people who work in animal conservation. And so I had to find a translator. And this was a really steep learning curve for me. I didn't know I live in Vancouver, Canada. I didn't know anybody in the Russian community, had no connections, very tenuous connections to anybody, in Russian tiger conservation, only emails. And so I sent, this is where universities are really, and just an incredible resource full of unexpected surprises. I sent an email to the Slavic Languages Department at UBC, and I didn't get anything back. But an email came to me from Nanjing, China, from a young man who said, well, my father teaches in the Slavic Languages Department at UBC, and he sent me this email. And in fact, I speak Mandarin and I speak Russian, and when I was at Harvard, I did my undergraduate thesis on illegal street vendors in the part of Russia you want to go. And even though I was beaten so bad I had to be hospitalized, I want to go back and see some friends. So if you take me there, I'll translate for you. And, I mean, this is the sad, but this is I said, oh, okay, well, that's very interesting. I'll check in with you later. And I went off to go find a real translator. And 6 weeks later, I found a lot of real translators, and translating is a white-collar job where you generally sit at a table or in an office. You don't hit the road for a month sleeping on the floor of whoever will have you. What I really needed was more like a fixer in a war zone, and I didn't realize that. So eventually I came crawling back to this guy, Josh, and I said, well, what do you think? And he said, well, actually, I'm coming to Vancouver, from Nanjing, China, next week. Why don't we have tea? So we sat down and had tea, and he said, I'm really not a translator. And I said, oh, really? And he said, yeah, but I do speak Mandarin and Russian and French and German, Swedish, Spanish, Italian, and a bit of Hebrew, and I'm working on Indonesian. And I said, oh, really? And how old are you anyway? And he said, I'm 25. And, this guy was basically a polyglot genius, and he wanted to go exactly where I wanted to go. And so we agreed then to go, and he was like a magic key. And I do feel sometimes, and maybe you've had this experience, when you're on the right path, it feels like barriers fall away. And the language barrier was massive. The culture barrier was equally huge. And this guy knew China really well, knew Russia really well. He had read classics in both their original languages from both countries. And so he was really my guide. And I was really the guy carrying the tape recorder, but he got us in everywhere. And we had incredible encounters. And it's, that was a really important learning for me. He was a teacher for me, but also just this idea of finding the perfect translator through this really quite random set of connections. This really happens in real life. I'm going to talk a little bit about writing. And in my case, the journey into writing has been an odd combination of one hand, really throwing myself on the mercy of total strangers in places that most people don't want to go, and then, as it is really for all writers and most students, an extraordinary amount of ass time, years and years, really kind of like college all over again. It's a little bit, I find freelancing a little bit like hitchhiking. You're really, putting yourself out there and hoping somebody will pick you up. And when you're going into a story, it doesn't matter if it's the Testicle Festival or the Russian Far East, you're still, crossing this huge cultural barrier, going into this place where you really have no connections and, frankly, no business being. And you're asking people to tell them about themselves and be hospitable to you. And I was really well treated down in Clinton, and I was really well treated in Russia too. And some of that has to do with, the way you comport yourself, and some of it has to do with good fortune, I think. But also, a lot of people given the chance, will be very generous. And it's been a really, wonderful discovery as I've gone around the world reporting just what people are willing to tell you, show you, feed you, where they're willing to take you. And as far as strangers go, I think it's really helpful to go into interviews, and if you're doing research for a thesis or for a newspaper or for a book, but to go into these encounters with as few expectations as possible. And we're full of expectations and full of biases. And what I've discovered is preconceptions can really get in the way. And on the face of it, what's more reprehensible than poaching endangered animals? Shooting tigers. If ever there was an unsympathetic character, it's a Russian poacher. A lot of these guys, alcohol and alcoholism is, endemic. It's just a sort of violent, dirty, chaotic business. And I wasn't prepared really to like any of these guys. But as I got to know them and what they'd endured and the way they'd tried to hold things together in their community and in their family in the face of really total political and industrial collapse, I began to have a lot more respect and compassion for them. In other words, go into the story prepared to be changed. As a writer, a reporter, a researcher, you're really an explorer, and so it's an asset to be kind of wide-eyed and innocent, but that openness can obviously be a liability too. You're very exposed. You want to hear stories, but you also want to make sure they're true. And truth, as we were discussing at dinner, is really subjective, right down to the color of a house, or, practically all the way to somebody's name. But in order to compensate for your own, enthusiasm and openness, you also really want to fact-check rigorously, and wherever possible, try to triangulate the stories you hear and cross-reference them. And that will often tease out the inaccuracies. The writer, one of the things the writer is, especially a reporter, is a professional listener. You possess, and in that role, you possess a kind of quiet power. People are sharing all kinds of things with you, and if you leave a space, it's amazing what people will fill it with, all kinds of confidences. And some of them can be terrifying and awful, and there are plenty of things that, you might wish you never heard. But if you're interested and attentive and trustworthy, you can be amply rewarded. And my mother, who's 81 years old, and really one of the most socially graceful people I know, told me that the definition of charm is the ability to get people to talk about themselves, is just to kind of create this encouraging environment. And it's a lot of what reporting is. It's engaged listening, actively accepting what a person has to say. And I should emphasize that acceptance is not the same as agreement. Acceptance is simply acknowledging, okay, for whatever reason, however bizarre or alienating, this is where you're at, this is what you believe, and my job as a writer, a reporter, a human being, is not to judge it right now, but to find out why it is so, why you think and feel the way you do. It's not therapy, but it can feel like that sometimes. And there's that famous saying that's been attributed to all kinds of people, but I really think it is just incredibly useful in this field, and that is, be kind. For everyone you meet is fighting a great battle. And a lot of times those battles are invisible, to the naked eye. But people are going through things. Right in this room, people are going through incredible intensities and keeping it together. And we need to acknowledge that possibility, that everyone you meet could be going through something cataclysmic. So 3 things I'll leave you with. One, take your teachers where you find them, because they're everywhere in every form. The more I learned about tigers, the more common ground I actually found between them and us. And to the point that a couple of years ago, I actually gave a TED Talk called 10 Lessons from a Tiger. And those lessons came as a direct result of researching this book. And it, of course, hadn't been the original intention. When I started out, I'd never considered the possibility that tigers had anything to teach me. And yet there's real wisdom in their behavior. Wisdom that is, they are apex predators, they are the rulers of their domain, and we share many commonalities. And in some ways, they manage their territories better than a lot of us do. 2, if you're going to write, make sure you exercise, because all that sitting isn't healthy. And the third thing I'll say at the risk of sounding like your grandmother, sit up straight. Now, I mean that seriously. Don't just take up space at your desk. Actively address it. When you physically manifest presence and intention, your mind is more likely to do the same. And over time, your body and your writing will thank you. It's not just you shaping the stories are also shaping you inside and out. The last concept I want to leave you with, and then we'll open it to questions. There's a Spanish word referring to the bulls, as in the fighting bulls, sense of stability, flexibility, and power in the bull ring. And that space that the bull occupies where he feels safe and in control is called querencia. And think of, a tennis player ready to receive a serve, or a boxer establishing a territory in the ring, or maybe how you might prepare yourself for a big test. That kind of sort of centered, grounded place, but also prepared to move. Tigers, of course, are all about querencia. They're really masters of it, at engineering positions of power, figuring out where the high ground is, where the sight lines are, and where your blind spots are. They're past masters at it. And I bring this up because if you're going to write, writing is hard to do. There's a lot of uncertainty in it. You're plumbing depths that you may not know where the bottom is. And it can be really helpful to first figure out where your own querencia is. And in a state of true querencia, I don't think you need to have a gun or a joint or a cell phone in your hands. This is a place where you're empowered by your own abilities and strength. So what I would suggest is that means turning off your phone and your Wi-Fi. I don't know if you've ever tried doing this, besides right now, of course, in this theater. But it can really be hard for some people, because there's this reassuring, superficially validating, neural hit every time that ping comes through, every time the message or the update registers. If those of you who are familiar with the comedian Louis C.K., I recommend you read his interview, 2013 interview in Rolling Stone, and he has a beautiful paragraph on just that, on turning off your machines in order to allow the creative process to really take hold. And I'm sure you all know this, but it's worth repeating, I think, that some of the biggest money and the brightest minds in the world are devoted full time to keeping your attention fixed on your screens, and they're not going to help you unhook. So we really have to do it for ourselves. And I say this really from personal experience, watching myself, watching my kids, and sometimes I feel like I'm watching rats and pigeons in a behavioral experiment, pawing and tapping for these little rewards. So in closing, I'd say if you're going to write seriously and well, and it doesn't matter if it's 500 words or 50,000, it's crucial that you be able to make that quiet, untrammeled space and discover your querencia within it. And, I realize multitasking is presented as this kind of 21st century superpower and virtue. But what it really is a dilution of your attention, and I would argue a dilution of your power. And when you're rock climbing in the middle of a pitch, or in the middle of a soccer game, or in the middle of basic training, you're not going to be taking a call or updating your Facebook status. And what I would like to say to you is your writing, your thoughts, your ideas, your efforts to make sense of the world you live in deserve the same quality of attention. And if they aren't given that kind of respect, the respect of space free from distraction, it's much harder to find out what you're truly capable of. And where you are right now at this, from what I can see and feel for this excellent university. You're in an amazing place to find out what you're capable of. And it's an incredible opportunity. And feel very fortunate to be sharing with you in it for a brief time. So thanks. And if there are questions or comments, I'd love to hear them. So thanks.
Thanks so much, John. I think there are microphones set up here. If people have questions they'd like to direct to John, please come forward with that. As always, if you can keep your questions relatively brief, it'll give us a little bit more time to get several people through. So I see our first person up here.
Hi.
Yeah, thanks for being here. If you could comment on the writing that went into both of your books. They have such a different voice, and in the first book, I'm never really aware of you or your process.
Huh.
And in the second book, I am. And I
Oh,
wonder
wow.
if that's the story that was given to you by each of those projects.
Oh, wow.
Were you more aware of your process in the second book than in the first? Or maybe you just had a different editor. I liked them both.
I'm assuming everybody's heard the question. So was my process different from one? These are my first two nonfiction books. And I like to think that I, for the second book, would have matured somewhat and that it would be a more graceful and perhaps even less noticeable voice. It sounds like you had the opposite experience. No one's ever brought that up to me before or made that observation. And I really felt like with both those projects that I was in a really good zone, and I was really excited about what I was writing about, really excited about what I was learning, felt, in control of what I was writing. I didn't feel, sometimes, the words and the ideas can really get away from you, and I felt pretty on top of it. I had very good editors, different editors, but very good editors for both books who rode herd on me, if you will. So I wish I had something conclusive to respond with, but I didn't personally notice a big difference, besides the fact that they were very, in their way, quite different stories.
So The Tiger is obviously a nonfiction book, but there's a lot of scenes in The Tiger where the only characters who are in it are all dead. So it seems like there's some kind of fiction writing that has to happen, especially the opening scene that you read. Can you just talk about filling in those blanks?
Absolutely, and it's really important. There's a kind of sleight of hand that you can do if you do enough research. And so that opening scene, everybody's dead. There are no witnesses, no living known witnesses to that opening scene. What there are the reports of the people who were the last to see Markov alive, the people who also discovered him after the tiger attacked him. There are weather reports. There are my own visits to the site during a very cold winter, so I could, see the plants, feel the weather, see how everything, I walked the walk that he walked. Then I had video, photographs, and so there are two places, I'm really glad you brought this up, there are two places where I say perhaps. And those are where I'm speculating. Perhaps he, thought about the fire he would build. Perhaps he thought about the burdens he would soon lay down. We don't know what he thought. So I say perhaps. But everything else is verifiable based on the accounts of witnesses. And, they knew he had one dog with him. I'm almost certain that the dog would have gone ahead. And then what you could see in the snow where the tiger attacked from, the tiger was waiting by his door. So there was this quiet moment. Certainly the dog would have smelled the tiger first. Tigers, they don't have actually as intense an odor as you might think, but they do have an odor. And so basically what I did is kind of chip by chip reassembled the mosaic that became this scene based on my own observations and all the other atmospheric bits and pieces I could cobble together. And that's a lot of, what you're doing is you're reconstructing a crime scene. It's like when they go down and pull a wrecked plane out of the ocean. They pull up all the pieces and they go into a hangar and put them all back together. And, that's what I did with this story. Hi.
Hi. To kind of follow on that last question, would you mind talking a little bit about the difference between writing a novel and writing nonfiction?
I'd be really happy to. It's been very much on my mind. Nonfiction, is where I started out, and, through journalism, I was very invested in facts, partly because if you write for the New Yorker or the Atlantic or the National Geographic, the fact-checking process is absolutely brutal, and if you get something by them and then you get busted, you're not going to work for them anymore, and it will probably be in a newspaper. People will write about it, and I know people to whom this has happened, and it's devastating to their careers. So that process really puts the fear of God in you as far as telling it as it really is. And likewise, enough people are still alive that if I get this story wrong, it's going to come back to me, and it hasn't. Fiction is obviously a really different animal, and to me, for my abilities, it's a more difficult practice. And this is my third book, The Jaguar's Children. It's a novel it's told in the first person by a young man from southern Mexico. And, how can I know what he would think or say? And, I lived in Oaxaca for a year, got to know a lot of people, but also I was frankly visited by this voice. And I had been taught by my nonfiction mentors not to trust imaginary voices. There's a lot in our culture that discourages us from acknowledging imaginary voices. But the voice was so insistent and so strong, I wrote it down, and I thought, well, maybe this is a novel starting to happen. And it turned out it was, and I saw it all the way through and published it, and actually got some really good reviews, and I'm really quite proud of it. And it's going into Mexican Spanish in about a year. And one of the things I did to deal with that, again going back to this, well, how could you possibly know what such a person would think, is I had many Mexican people read it, and people who know Oaxaca, where I was living, very well, who know the issues really well. And I said, where are the false notes? Where does it sound like a gringo trying to impersonate, a young Mexican man? And so all those are gone, I hope. And but there is in fiction, you're really almost operating in this other dimension, and you're halfway rooted in the real world because you need the facts to anchor it if you're writing about things that actually happen, like contemporary illegal immigration. But you also need to have room for this other voice, these other characters. I met a lot of people I'd never seen before. They're not modeled on people I met down there. And I can only, refer or recommend you talk to other fiction writers on campus here, because I think it's probably the same for a lot of us. But, it's an amazing adventure, but it's also very disconcerting, but, incredibly exciting in a totally different way than nonfiction.
Hi. You say in the book that the Russian people were misinformed to a point of legend, but it's also a grain of it is truth. Do you think this could not only be the USSR's efforts to censor its people, but almost a perestroikan counterculture that's emerged, for lack of a better term, where people have become so self-interested that they don't want to help the Far East or much less think about it?
Wow. Feels like two questions there. I do feel like, and this is true in, propaganda, the Russians, the communists do not have a corner on the propaganda market. It's everywhere, and we are inundated with a lot of it here too. But at the height of communism, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and before, truth and reality was such a malleable plaything of the people in power, the people who basically controlled the radios and the speakers that were planted all over towns, projecting the message, that I think it was very, very difficult to know where the bottom was, where's the ground, what's really true here. And I think when that happens for generations, I think it can be quite psychologically damaging, in terms of your sense of trust and your sense of what do you owe another person in terms of an honest response. And that's something I felt more than saw literally. And then as far as, the current era, and, I do think, historically the Far East has always been sort of forgotten. It's really over the horizon. It's 7 time zones away from Moscow. And so much of Russia, so much of Russian culture, so much of its identity, its sense of itself, and the outside world's sense of it is all Ural Mountains westward. And then you have Siberia, which is, this weird netherworld, and the Far East is almost an afterthought. And really, I met Russians who didn't know where it was. They had no idea there were tigers there. There's enormous ignorance, and partly because Primorsky Krai was actually closed off. It was heavily militarized, partly because of anxiety about the Japanese and the Americans, and so no one could go in there. It was just a sealed zone. Not the only one in Russia, but a big one. And so that was another reason, there's a lack of information, a lack of investment, psychically, or a sense of, this is part of our country too. So there are, many, many factors, and I don't feel equipped to speak to all of them by any means, but you do have the sense there that you're kind of in the back of beyond. And a lot of people who got there were sent there as literally as exiles, and they're the children of exiles. And that's a kind of psychic burden that you never quite get over. And yet there's no place to go back to.
Hi.
Hi.
As an amateur writer, I find that I have hit certain barriers. Like, I usually, as a nature writer, I try to describe really well what I'm seeing as I'm hiking, and I've found that I've hit a barrier where I just keep running into the same words, and I'm wondering how you get around that.
Yeah. How do you freshen the language? It's really a huge issue. And I read someone was talking about the latest best American poetry. And the writer was saying they think that the theme of the crocus has been exhausted. There's nothing more that can be said about a crocus. So, leave it to, Wordsworth and his daffodils, and maybe we should have stopped 200 years ago. But I don't think we should stop trying to describe nature. What I do, and it's fun to do, and I think it can also help people relate to it, is I had to describe a tiger, obviously, and at one point I resorted to describing it like a basketball team. And that's sort of a far-out idea, but when you actually really start thinking about how a tiger works, it really does make sense. And so, what I might first do is just try on different lenses, or try different perspectives. There's a lot of bad photography where people just sort of stand there and shoot it, instead of getting down at, eye level to it, or getting underneath it, or trying a more interesting angle, or framing the shot. And maybe, to think about it that way, maybe even to go out and look at what you're trying to write about through a viewfinder from different angles and see what you see. Because you may see things behind it that set it off. You may see other color combinations or color contrasts. You may see textural things. You could start really, really small. You could go in, almost from an insect's point of view, or from the point of view of, watching some other creature interact with this thing that you're trying to describe. That might be a way into it. So I would basically, abandon your vocabulary for the time being. There's always a thesaurus, but more fun, I think, and more creative would be just to try to look at it literally through different eyes, and that might be lying on the ground, that might be, again, the viewfinder, that might be observing other ways of being with this entity than the ways that you're used to doing it, as a hiker, or as a biologist. So that would be a couple things I'd try. But I feel you.
Well, I'm going to take advantage of asking the last question that I don't see anybody else may here, and maybe a bit unfair, but I was talking to John a little bit about dinner tonight, and I was so struck, as I mentioned in my introductory comments, about the influence that different forms of culture and society have on the natural world in which we live. And I was very aware of the real sense of threat to the wild tiger and how perilous its future is. At the same time, living here in Montana, where 20 years ago there were no wolves, and there was a shift from 100 years ago where there was an intense effort to extirpate all the wolves here. And there's a societal shift, not without a lot of conflict, but to actually bring wolves back. And now wolves, one of the top predator species, are thriving again in Montana. Still a lot of conflict around that. But it made me think that's a relatively short amount of time for a dramatic cultural shift to take place. And I wonder what your sense right now is about the place of the tiger and whether these kinds of shifts are underway, can be taken away, or whether it's really a perilous future right now.
Thanks. And I think there's a lot of common ground and similarity between how Montanans feel about wolves, from every point of view, and how people in the Russian Far East feel about tigers. And, on the one hand, they're iconic, they're powerful symbols, they're really beautiful. On the other hand, if you're broke and all you have is a horse to ride, and that tiger comes in and kills your horse, you're going to kill the tiger. And so that tension is very much alive. And, it's really, what's amazing to me is, we're quite, in some ways progressive, certainly wealthy, well-equipped, large country, with tremendous resources to bring to bear. And what's amazing to me is that people are having these same conversations, grappling with these same issues in the Russian Far East, where the boundary between the law and the mafia, between crime and a legitimate job, is completely blurred. And it's a very challenging situation in which to work, and yet people are working there, Russian, American, British, Chinese, trying to have these conversations. And it's really incredible, just at the human level, at the social level. I think it actually could be a really interesting thesis. And when you really, it's just like here when somebody shouts at you out of their truck. Once you get through the kind of knee-jerk defensiveness, there's usually a human being in there with a legitimate grievance. And if you give them an unthreatened space to talk about it in, you can really make some progress. And a lot of people, even though tigers are no direct benefit to them, don't want to see them wiped out. But they don't want to be hurt by them or frightened of them either. And, it's so, in some ways, there are many fewer resources to work with over there, and yet people are, in many cases, functioning at this sort of progressive level, partly because tiger conservation has been going on in Russia since the 1940s. It was the first country to declare the tiger a protected species, and it's actually a positive legacy of the Soviet era, and people remember that. And also, people don't like the idea of killing tigers and selling them to the Chinese, partly because there's a lot of, racism and xenophobia, but also because, it's shameful, to take this thing that is beautiful, powerful, and iconic to where you live and sell it in parts across the border on a black market. Nobody feels good about doing that. So I frankly feel hopeful about it. And, Dale Mikkel, who's, working with the Wildlife Conservation Society, I know that the university has affiliations with that really potent organization. He's been doing incredible diplomatic work with the Chinese along the border so that now tigers are walking freely into China, and they never used to come back. And they're coming back now. And what it means is they're surviving the trip into China, and that's huge progress. because things, aren't that much better on the Chinese side, and Tiger's worth an incredible amount of money. So just the fact that tigers are making a two-way trip is, a really beautiful, hopeful thing. And the fact that it's taking place under such difficult diplomatic, social, political, economic circumstances is really almost miraculous. And it says a lot for the animals and also for the human beings working on their behalf.
All right. Well, before we thank John for a fantastic book and a fantastic presentation, I want to remind people that his books are available in the lobby here. I suspect you'll be willing to sign them for there, so. But let's please join me in welcoming or in thanking John for his presentation. Thank you very much.